You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Insights, a podcast series by the Conference Board. Insights conversations take an objective, fact-based look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board and host of this podcast. Today's conversation will focus on the Ukraine-Russia war, employee benefits, pay and well-being implications. Our guest today is Neil McPherson, who is Council Director at the Conference Board for our Global Benefits Council. Our councils bring together senior executives together to learn from one another, share issues and exchange for solutions. Today, Neil is going to share what our global benefits executives from leading multinationals are doing to take care of employees affected by this crisis. Welcome, Neil.
Hello, Sarah. Nice to be with you.
So, the immediate focus has clearly been on the well-being of employees and their dependents. Can you talk a little bit about what our members have been saying and what their companies have been doing in terms of, the practical issues of getting salaries out, emergency supplies, how they're managing to track employees and how they're providing support for them?
Sure, this was well-being in its absolute purest sense. The well-being programs among our members has been top of the agenda for our members for a number of years now. But this was literally life and death well-being. We had our meeting on this. It was effectively an emergency meeting early in after the invasion, and in many ways it mirrored a session we had 2 years earlier, also in March, when COVID struck, as that was uncharted territory, and members were reacting to an unfolding event. So that was very, very similar, but here of a somewhat darker hue, in that it was literally life and death, and the practical considerations that members were having to think through and act upon at pace to protect their employees' life and well-being, particularly in Ukraine, but we also covered Russia and Belarus as well. So the first point was the immediate point was the movement of those Ukrainian employees, those that wanted to and those that were able to and could under law, to neighbouring states, with particularly to Poland was the direction there. And many companies, or most of the companies with operations in Ukraine and in Russia, have also got operations in Poland. And I think it's worth noting that the reaction of their Polish colleagues has been maybe not surprising, but still pretty astounding, in volunteering to pick up their Ukrainian colleagues at the border and home them and find them accommodation and support. And that's out with the company's actions as well. That was colleagues supporting colleagues. So the transportation, the accommodation, medical and employment considerations I'll come to a bit later, but there were also some important considerations. One member, for example, had an employee who was 8.5 months pregnant, and the hospital had been bombed. And they had to get her out. And they discovered, again, these aren't things that you had in the manual, that Romania, for example, had loosened their social security consideration and rules very quickly after, and very generously after the invasion. And the company ensured that the employee got to Romania so she could have the medical coverage necessary for her pregnancy, and that helped a great deal. There was also the next thing was medical insurance. That was the really big thing. Pay and jobs came after these immediate things, because there were some internal emergency services in place already, but there are also a number of gaps in the coverage. So some members purchased, external insurance packages for a limited amount of time, short-term packages, or used their general expat cover and extended it, but excluded expensive options such as US cover as stopgaps to help cover their employees. So 30-day temporary packages, which will have expired now unless they've been rolled over. And then we even drifted into other factors on that, given the Chernobyl implications, you'll remember. Someone raised the concern on a nuclear disaster, which when you say it like that sounds beyond the realms of fantasy, but it really wasn't and really isn't in many ways. Whether that would add a different dimension to insurance plans and what would be covered and would plans remain in place. So there was lots of multifaceted actions on there, on safety and immediate recovery of the staff at that time.
Thank you. And what about staff who have or choose to remain in Ukraine? I mean, we've heard also of some people who have chosen to even fight on the front line. What sort of implications does that cause for
Yeah,
companies?
some of that, of course, was the law. The young male employees had to stay. But then that raised secondary implications, and others, many companies had many Ukrainian staff in Poland, for example, who wanted to go back and fight on the front line. So what do? Do you give them leave of absence? Do you give them paid leave of absence? If you have Polish employees, and this was some of the cases as well, who also wanted to show their support and go and fight. So leave policies within a well-being context for our members in a more tranquil world have been right at the top of the agenda. But now these are leave policies with a twist because you're going to the front line. That also had very serious and again unprecedented implications on medical insurance and life insurance rather. And if they soon discovered as they just talked to their insurers, who I think were probably digging deep into the knitting of what was not explicit in the policies, that employees who were killed effectively as civilians, in inverted commas, through a shell or a bomb at their workplace or their home would be covered, but an employee killed fighting on the front line would not be covered. So how would a company respond to that? In many cases, companies were having to make these decisions quickly, as I mentioned, and they were deciding to self-insure this risk. And those members that have captive insurers were exploring this flexibility that this afforded. Some companies also found that they had different life cover for different categories of employees. So they were having to go through each case individually in many respects to find out what can be done and address any exclusions that might be there. So stepping back a sec, the overwhelming response from our members, somewhat unsurprisingly, but it's a credit to our members, was this immediate supportiveness and going the extra mile and trying to find as much flexibility for their staff and employees affected by the region that they could until they came up against the small print, so to speak. But even then, finding a way around that to the extent possible in a fast-moving situation.
But if someone did choose to fight, Neil, are you saying that most companies on the whole are offering paid leave? And the reason I answer that is we don't know how long this is going to go
No,
on. So, I
yeah.
mean, is it paid leave indefinitely? I mean, how?
Well, the paid or unpaid leave hadn't been decided at that time. This was early March, and it was the question was, if they want to go, do we say no, you can't go, and if you go, you'll lose your job? The tenor of the room was tending towards you can go and your job will remain open. The paid or unpaid was moot, I think, as you suggest, because we don't know how long it's going to be for. But at that stage, and we'll come on to it a bit later on the job and the maintenance of the function, if you like, the role of these employees as separate to the immediate safety, and then the implications of what they had to do. Because those employees in Ukraine, by law, had to fight. Their jobs, were acquired. So that was the issue there.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, many employees, they've been displaced to neighbouring countries, the majority in Poland. How are companies dealing with this, and what sort of implications are there?
Well, beyond the immediate point we touched on of finding them a place of safety, many were then looking at how do we financially support them via pay and a job. Are there jobs that can be effectively pop-up jobs set up? Can they do the job from Warsaw or Krakow or Bucharest or wherever, and they were doing it? And all companies were looking at those implications. But obviously, not all jobs could do that, production jobs, for example. But to the extent possible, jobs were being set up in the neighboring states. But then that brought the issue of pay and length of pay, and Ukrainian salaries paid in Ukrainian local currency don't stretch as far, just on the cost of living basis, in EU countries such as Poland as they did in Ukraine. So how do we address that? Do you start paying them in local currency or remain in Ukrainian currency? One company decided to pay for 3 months accommodation for all its Ukrainian employees that are leaving the country as a block sort of grant, so to speak. This will get through the immediate post-invasion exigency of the crisis. Another was offering cash support to employees around the world, for example, that may have had dependents in Ukraine. So an employee in Hong Kong whose parents were in Kyiv, then this company were offering them cash support, which then they could transmit to help their relations in the country, whether that's visas, whether that's transports, whether that's food, as broad as that. And I think that's another great example of the flexibility and the creativity of these members. I nearly said acting on the hoof. They weren't acting on the hoof. They were acting in crisis mode to come up with the best, most flexible solutions that they can come up with. So these creating the vacancies, the long-term sustainability of that, we discussed how sustainable that was, and it was still an open question whether those roles can be transported for any serious length of time to other countries. But much of that will be role dependent.
And are you seeing employee assistant programs? How are employees equipped to communicate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was interesting. It's also just one thing on the pay point again. Another example of the flexibility. Many companies were accelerating their annual pay process, including SDI payments, which I'd say were, for example, were often usually paid in April. They were front-ending that to be paid in early March and accelerating the merit processes, effectively to get as much cash that is going to be due these employees early. We'll come to Russia later when we talk about Russia, because there are some different implications there. The EAPs were an interesting one. Some had EAP in place, but not many, and they were looking to set them up, and they did that. One company had a global EAP program already in place, which they said is usually very well used, but at first blush, surprisingly, they were receiving a very small number of calls from the Ukraine. And we reflected on this, and the view was that while the EAP may be a long-term solution for employee well-being and family well-being and mental health, etc., at the time we were doing the call, it wasn't particularly useful because people had more urgent priorities of finding a way out of the country and then somewhere of live. So the volume of calls at that time, the company providing it was surprised it was low, but they fully anticipate that would pick up. And I'm pretty sure that since we've had that meeting and most of those employees have now moved to neighbouring countries, that I'm sure that will have now increased.
Hmm.
And it's also, I think it's worth stressing, I touched on it there, that these EAP programs from now and moving forward, it's not only the psychological but also the legal and the financial situations that has been so totally disrupted for these staff, such as people not having access to their bank account, for example, or not sure of their immigration status. It's so multifaceted and outside the realms of what the program's initial purpose was, or initial perspective was there for, that it's going to test them in that time, I should think.
Yeah, indeed. There's just so many unknowns, really, that
Yeah.
are having to be dealt with, aren't there? Yeah.
Contact between is probably worth mentioning. Contact between, because in many cases phone lines, etc., or Wi-Fi was down for staff, and I'd never heard of it, but a program called Viber is very popular in Eastern Europe, much more used instead of WhatsApp, and it was this Viber that employees in country were using to contact each other and support each other with information on leaving the country or what's happening, and of course for the firm outside the country to contact its team in the country.
So we've talked about how companies are helping staff and families get to a place of safety, practical matters such as salaries, life insurance, medical support, what support has been provided to those who remain in Ukraine. Next, we'll look at the emotional tension between Russian and Eastern European staff, helping employees who are feeling anxious, and communications again. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Neil.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Insights podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Neil McPherson. So, Neil, what about Russian employees and expats in Russia? Obviously we're monitoring the situation closely, but what contingency plans are in place, and how are companies dealing with that?
Yeah, we spent quite a lot of time on Russia on our call, and I listened with great interest to the excellent podcast that my colleague Anne Stevens did. And she mentioned the expats in particular, and that most had been extracted early, so to speak, or right there, and that was very much the reflected what was in my council members as well. So the expat position was largely solved through fast action on that. So the concern on, well, there's twofold aspect on the Russia. One was tensions, to put it bluntly, between Russian staff and Ukrainian staff that may be working elsewhere. And that was discussed in one Western European country where the head office is a very multinational head office. Russians and Ukrainians were working together, often with Russians working for Ukrainians or the other way around. And the member said, yes, there are tensions, unsurprisingly, in many ways, which hadn't boiled over, but there were tensions, and the firm was aware of that. Of more concern, because those tensions were being rolled out in a safe European home, which is a song by The Clash, I think. Anyway, more concerned with the people in Russia. Belarus, very few had any significant operations or staffing in Belarus. because their employees in Russia were who are generally urban and generally younger, given the nature of our members, and most of them are devastated about what has happened, are desperately concerned about the impact on their country, on Russia, and on Ukraine, and potentially on the impact on them as well. And we hear rumours of this. I was listening to the radio over the weekend with this much mooted next stage of the Russian stage of the war, and the potential for conscription, for example, in Russia. And many of our member staff are of the age where conscription may be a real possibility. So this was a month or so ago. We were talking 3 or 4 weeks, but even then that was an issue. And then, of course, the impact of sanctions on them, their livelihoods, their jobs going through. One of our members was giving a 3-month salary advance to their employees in Russia in an attempt to get what was due to them ahead of the sanctions biting. You'll recall that the sanctions were stepped in many instances, particularly across the Russian banks. But some of those staff, and this was curious, some of those staff in Russia were afraid to take the money. They didn't want to take it because they were worried that the state would appropriate those payments to use for the war efforts, would see that it was money that they could take. So, and I think that the whole Russian employees point, and as sanctions bite, will have similar long-term implications for those members in their livelihood, if not their life, in Russia, and it is uncertain to see how that will go. And they, in many cases, will not have the option of leaving the country, unfortunately. So that was the situation in Russia and Belarus, I would
Very
say.
sad situation, and that just leads me to my next question, which is, well, what about those Russian employees and their pensions? Because is this affected given the sanctions? And if so,
Yes.
how do companies respond? Does it only affect Russian employees, or does it affect European-wide employees?
Yes, Russian pensions in our council, which used to be called the Pension Council and has now evolved and is now the Global Benefits Council. The curate's egg of Russians' pensions has been on our agenda for as long as I've been involved with the council, mostly because the providers of company pensions or second pillar pensions in Russia have been Russian financial institutions, many of which in the past have been of dubious provenance. They tend to change hands quite rapidly in many instances and are bought up by an oligarch here, an oligarch there, or wherever, and fall into private hands. So in the old days, when your main concern was know your customer and who is providing the pensions and is it a viable institution, that was on our members' agendas. But now, of course, those providers are pretty well wholesale, if not completely now, they soon will be sanctioned. So there is you can't deal with them from externally. Now, internally, of course, you'd still be able to receive your pension or your contributions into it, because again, most of these staff are going to be young, and few of them will be drawing their pensions yet. But the viability of these banks, and with that, how secure the pensions pots they've built up will be, which will be in local currency, I would think is an open question. It's not an issue that's had any serious consideration in the media, where the whole focus has been on Russian investment of Western European pension schemes, which has been de minimis effectively in most cases. But yes, there is a strong risk that those pension pots, if those banks fail, which will only add to the agony and uncertainty of those Russian employees of their wealth, their well-being, and their livelihood.
Gosh. our member companies are also global organisations. I'm sure that there are many different perceptions about the war depending on where an employee is based around the world. Are you hearing any perspectives from Asia or China?
Yes, China in particular was explicitly mentioned. So that had come up, and again, we had this session 3 or 4 weeks ago. So that was a live issue there. And there were two facets to that. One was China's support or im- implied support or tacit support of the Russian regime and what it was doing. It wasn't voting against, for example, in the UN. And would that have sanction implications for China potentially, and then the implications of that? But I think of more immediate concern there, both immediate concern for a long-term consequence, was depending on how this goes, was the implications for Taiwan and whether China uses the Russian aggression in Ukraine as a green light to get what it wants within Taiwan. Um, and that extends further as well. This is again using the COVID analogy. When COVID came, we were looking to build, and we've developed a whole hybrid working policy out of that development, which was unanticipated. In many ways, what's going on now, I don't think it's too dramatic to say, is a potential dry run for the Baltics and for Poland, which have much more significant um, workforces and operations for our members than Ukraine and Russia do in most cases, at least. And so, what goes here now? Hope to God it doesn't happen, but you never know. That
Hmm.
what's done now may need to be the dry run or the manual for later. Uh, so depending on which has never really occurred with our members, because the other areas where these issues have happened, be it Syria, be it Afghanistan, be it Libya, have not had large um, operations for
Hmm.
most of our members. Um, but this is different, and there's also and that ability to help members cross borders and save themselves has been different.
Yeah, huge implications. I'm conscious of the time, Neil. Any final comments or observations from the council?
Yeah, I would. To state the obvious, it's a fast moving and developing situation and story. And I think we're probably through for most of our members of the council, and this is probably true for most members of the conference board around the world, given the nature of their operations, that we're probably over phase one to the extent now, which was very much our area of immediate focus, which was the extraction of employees and their immediate family to safety. And much of that will have been from Western Ukraine, again from Lviv or Kiev, where the major cities and operations were, and Kharkiv as well, to an extent. We had members with operations there. Phase two, we're in now, I think, which is open ended. You touched on that earlier, how long, which is the support being provided um, those employees and their families where they are in safety, and the transition of jobs, as we discussed, to the extent possible, and how readily that can be done, and for how long a period can that be done. I think phase three is the cloud on the horizon that we don't know, which is where and when this will end, and what form reconstruction will take. Frankly, will companies go back? Will there be something for the companies to go back um, to go back to the situation before the invasion? And that is all open. I don't think that's the top priority for most members now, but it's certainly one that CHROs and others around around the conference board will be thinking. But the answer is we don't know, and we need to um, plan that um, and the many avenues that could take. So a very sad situation and very very important. And I think the bright light is the reaction of our members, and the concern, the flexibility, and the culture of looking after their staff has shone through with every single member I've spoken to.
Absolutely.
So hats off to them for that.
Absolutely. But I mean, as you said, the implications, they're so far reaching, long lasting. People are starting a new life in a different country, a different education system, different languages. There's huge implications here. And the key question is how long? And equally, this talent drain from Ukraine, will they go back, or is it, is it gone forever? So some huge questions and issues that companies will have to be navigating over the next few weeks and months. But thank you, Neil. Thank you so much for your time today and for leading the council and helping our members share with one another and understand how to navigate this very sad and sensitive situation. And thank you all for listening to this Insights podcast. Every few weeks we'll bring experts to provide insights on this issue, and we'll cover leading topics from public policy to human capital to environment, economic and communications issues. So please share this podcast with your colleagues. I'm Sara Murray, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.